Good day, this is Madeline Ibarzabal and I am going to discuss about the traditional and authentic assessment in social studies. So here's our objectives. Distinguish the different types of traditional and authentic assessment in social studies. Determine the appropriate assessment type to use in the classroom assessment. Traditional and authentic assessments are crucial aspects of classroom assessment. However, as time passed by, many misconceptions have risen, especially in this aspect. One can argue that authentic assessment is far better than traditional assessment. This is an example of a concept that you need to understand in order to become the best teacher. In this lesson, we will be able to know what is traditional and authentic assessment, its purpose, strength, limitation, types, guidelines, and cardinal rules in planning and implementing the authentic assessments. Now let's begin the traditional assessment. According to Cajigal and Mantauno 2014, paper and pencil test is the best example of traditional assessment which is used to determine the student's learning outcomes. These assessments are easy to grade but only test isolated application, facts, or memorized data at lower level thinking skills. So traditional assessments refers to the tools such as multiple choice test, true or false, fill in the blanks, matching types, and many other. So these forms of test may be standardized or teacher-made. Having a strong focus on the cognitive aspect, traditional assessment is considered as indirect and inauthentic approach in measuring student learning outcomes. Now let's proceed to the purposes of traditional assessment. We have to evaluate learners, to rank learners, and to give feedback of evaluation results. First, we have evaluate learners. Traditional assessment is mainly administered to gather academic data to be used in evaluation purposes. With the data at hand, teachers are able to identify the extent of student learning. Specifically, this type of assessment can be easily give feedback to teachers on what competencies the learners understood and failed to understand. Second, we have to rank learners. With the accessibility of assessment data, it is quite easier for teachers to rank students. Traditional assessment in the form of examination is usually given high emphasis rather than performance. This is all because this type of assessment elicits information relatively faster compared to authentic assessments which requires more preparations. Third, we have to give feedback of evaluation results. Once the teachers are done with the evaluation process, it is now time for them to report the results of the evaluation. The results are placed in a report card and are given to the parents during the parent-teacher conference. Now let's proceed to the strengths of traditional assessment. First, we have reliability. An assessment tool is reliable when it measures what is supposed to measure. This is the main highlight of traditional assessment. Teachers are able to convert the different competencies required in the curriculum guide in the form of an objective type of test. In this slide, the teachers will generate information that is based on what is required. Second, we have validity. Traditional assessments becomes valid only when it answers the following questions. First, we have what is to be measured. And second, we have how consistently is it measured. This implies that valid assessment tools will allow the learners to score the same regardless of the date they take the exam and whoever administered the exam. Next, we have easy to administer and check. The paper and pencil type of test generally contain only specific answer per item, which makes it easier to administer and check. Unlike performances, this type of assessment focuses only on a specific learning outcome and does not require more time and effort. Now let's proceed to the limitations of traditional assessments. First, we have individualist. Traditional assessment is mainly designed to measure learning on an individual basis. The learners may find it difficult, especially during quarterly assessment, because of the depth and breadth of content. Moreover, it moves away from the aim of 21st century skills, which aims to develop collaboration skills among learners. Lastly, though it is easy to check, teachers might also find it difficult to check papers depending on the quantity of learners. Next limitation of traditional assessment is competition. 21st century education promotes collaboration among learners. However, traditional assessment is limited only to individual learners, which could start and cultivate competition among other learners. Now let's proceed to the guidelines to promote validity and reliability in traditional assessment items. So this is the guidelines for matching items. Next, we have the guidelines for fill-in-the-blank items. Another, we have multiple choice questions. And lastly, we have short answer questions. Now teachers are faced with various dilemmas with regard to classroom assessment. From the limited pool of assessment strategies to time constraints, the quality of assessment is definitely placed at stake. To avoid this, teachers must bear in mind that the best assessment technique should target a wide range of objectives that could enhance the cognitive, affective, and psychomotor skills of the learners. Now let's talk about authentic assessment. So authentic assessment is a measurement of the intellectual accomplishments that are worthwhile, significant, and meaningful. Now let's talk about authentic assessment. So Janis, Louis, and Akrofi 2007 emphasized that the idea of authentic assessment is mainly based on a constructivist perspective of learning wherein the interplay of learners, materials, and content affects the learning outcomes. In this light, we can firmly say that the assessment strategies that are grounded in constructivism must emphasize both the process and the outcomes. So the purpose of authentic assessment is to provide students with ample opportunity to engage in authentic tasks so as to develop, use, and extend their knowledge, higher order thinking skills, and other 21st century competencies. So authentic assessment is sometimes called alternative assessment. However, there is a thin line that separates the two. Alternative assessment, based on the name, is a form of assessment that moves away the traditional paper and pen form of assessment. This could be in the form of performance-based assessment, product-based assessment, portfolio assessment, and many others. On the other hand, authentic assessment is a form of assessment that aims to allow the learners to stimulate real-life situations to ensure authentic lifelong learning. Hence, alternative assessment could possibly be an authentic assessment at the same time, but it is also possible to have an authentic assessment that is objectified paper and pen type of task. Now let's proceed to the cardinal rules in planning and implementing authentic assessment by TAI 2017. First, we have determining the skills and achievement that students will develop. To ensure that the assessment is valid, it should always be grounded on the curriculum standards and learning competencies. It can be determined using the curriculum guide provided by the Department of Education. Next, we have elaborating the tasks that students will use to demonstrate their skills and achievements. The success of any assessment activity, may it be formative or summative, depends on the intended goals and outcomes. Communicating the goals to the learners must be a norm to them to gauge themselves and whatever activity or performance they will have to do. Finally, teachers must also process the outcomes of any activity for the learners to see the reason why they had to undergo such activity. The third cardinal rule is determining and communicating scoring rubrics for evaluation. Every activity that students do, they must be guided by how they will have to be graded. For this reason, they will know on which part of the performance or project they have to put more weight or emphasis. Fourth, we have identifying proofs for supporting decisions. If possible, teachers in basic education must always elaborate on why the learners ended up with their scores. In doing so, teachers should have them pieces of evidence that would help them communicate the learners their success and lapses. The last cardinal rule is improving educational instructional programs. Finally, authentic assessment must always address the improvement of educational outcomes. To achieve this, teachers should have a strong background on how authentic assessments work and how to properly align the performances or activities with the standards and objectives. Now let's proceed to the strengths of authentic assessment. First, we have authentic assessments are direct measure. The main idea behind authentic assessment is for learners to use in real life what they have learned inside the classroom. By immersing the learners through various authentic tasks, learners are not only achieving the lesson's objectives, but also gaining authentic learnings useful when they go out of school. That is why authentic assessment, when properly implemented, directly measures learning. Second, we have authentic assessments capture the constructive nature of learning. As reflected in K-12 curriculum, social studies education must be constructive in nature, where learners are not passive receivers of knowledge, but rather the creator and developer of skills. Thus, authentic assessment can properly address this demand by implementing tasks or performances that are performance-based in nature. Third, we have authentic assessment integrate teaching, learning, and assessment. In this model, it is possible to combine teaching, learning, and assessment. While students are evaluated in performing a specific task, teaching and learning may take place at the same time. This encourages the development of a wide range of skills such as problem solving and decision-making skills. Lastly, we have authentic assessments provide multiple paths to demonstration. There are various ways for learners to demonstrate how much they have learned. Moreover, the learners may also have the freedom to choose how they will showcase their extent of learning. In a similar context, authentic assessments also promotes multiple intelligences by allowing the learners to perform at their most comfortable skills. Now, let's talk about the limitations of authentic assessments. First, we have subjectivity in scoring. With this kind of assessment, it is unavoidable that teachers already have preconceived ideas about their learners. This kind of perceptions tends to result in biased evaluation results. Hence, teachers are advised to create their own ways to remove or if not, minimize the preconception of learners' strengths and weakness. Next, we have costliness. Learners in the 21st century tend to increase their competitiveness toward attaining learning outcomes. This means that in performing authentic tasks, learners may produce materials that would help them achieve high scores. To avoid this trend, teachers must clearly explain the criteria, scoring rubrics for them to focus on the criteria that has heavier weight. Next, limit skills and knowledge that are assessed. Another limitation of authentic assessment is that it only focuses on what is required. Due to the demands of performances, the learners may only address few learning competencies required in the curriculum guide, which brings us to the next limitations. Lastly, we have time constraints. It is apparent that when students have to perform, they should also be given enough time to consolidate their concepts and practice. In this light, it costs not only financial resources but also instructional time. To understand deeper, I have here a comparison between traditional and authentic assessment by Lombardi 2019. Now, it is apparent that both traditional and authentic assessments have their own concepts and applicability. Also laid down the general differences between the two, particularly in their nature and purposes. Therefore, There is no better form of assessment because both of them have advantages and disadvantages. This leads us to the general understanding that traditional assessment and authentic assessment are both needed inside the classroom. And we need to understand when to use traditional and authentic forms of assessment. First, we have to go back to the curriculum guide. Second, know the purpose of assessment. Finally, in planning and implementing both traditional and authentic assessments, teachers must be creative and reflective. It might be a very tedious process, but we have to keep in mind that this is our calling, a mission and vocation. Nothing is more fulfilling than seeing the learners satisfied with the manner of your teaching. It all starts from knowing what type of assessment to implement in the classroom. So that is all for traditional and authentic assessments. Thank you for listening.